So Alyssa, what's on your radar?
In the coming months, there will be no shortage of postmortems and after-action reports on what went wrong in Afghanistan, what we could have done better, and where we go from here. My prediction now is that our elite governing class will retreat into their own corners of presuppositions and choose to view the world as they want to, rather than how it is. One area that I expect to see this be particularly pronounced in is in trying to reconcile the goals of the feminist movement with the plight of Afghan women following our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Heather Barr, co-director of the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Council, eloquently writes, quote, Afghan women find themselves in the untenable position of looking for help to the international community, but these countries, the United States chief among them, are licking their wounds after 2 decades of military failure. Which raises the question, where was the United Nations during this withdrawal? Why didn't President Biden work with the international community to try to secure basic rights for millions of women being left in the wake of our war? Under Taliban rule, women are already being subjected to forced marriage, rape, or being barred from education, from working and participating in public life. With prior planning, the U.S. could have and should have worked with the international partners to structure a departure that puts checks in place to protect women, girls, and religious minorities. The United Nations exists to support peace and humanitarian efforts in destabilized parts of the world. The Taliban has made abundantly clear that they want to be recognized as a legitimate government. What better card for the UN to play than to say recognition by the United Nations would be contingent on respecting the rights of women and minorities? In World Politics Review, Professor Charlie Carpenter, a human rights advocate, makes the case the international community could step into the fold to help, writing, quote, in the face of the Afghan women's desperate pleas for support, women's rights NGOs in the U.S. recently called for the United Nations peacekeeping operation in Afghanistan. There is no question that such an operation, if mounted earlier, would have been beneficial to Afghan civilians and particularly women. As much scholarly work shows, UN peacekeeping operations work better than Western counterinsurgencies at maintaining durable peace, protecting civilians, and building a culture of human rights. It's not too late for President Biden to work with the UN and human rights-focused NGOs to protect the women of Afghanistan. But I fear the president who claims to be for advancing women only cares about advancing American women. I pose the question, how can one credibly claim to be a feminist, but then not care about women being raped, subjugated, barred from education and public life, and forced into coercive marriages? Modern feminism is facing a brain death as liberals back Biden's heartless, rapid withdrawal from engagement in Afghanistan. And let's be clear, forced marriage and forced Sharia law are not simply different ways of life. Tens of millions of Muslim women around the world live peacefully and with relative freedom. It is a dark, dangerous sect of extremist Islam that forces women into the dark ages. This is a blight on the entire world community, and to turn a blind eye is complicity. Afghan journalist Nazira Karimi spoke out earlier this week saying, quote, everybody is upset, especially women. Women had a lot of achievement in Afghanistan. I had a lot of achievement. I left from the Taliban like 20 years ago. Now we go back to the first step all over again. Now, let's be clear. Anyone claiming today that the reason we went to war and lost 2,400 souls and spent $3 trillion was to liberate the oppressed women of Afghanistan would be lying to you. I acknowledge that fully. But a good side effect of the terrible 20 years of war in Afghanistan was that the country was freer for women than it had been since the 1970s. Prior to the fall this past week to the Taliban, women in Afghanistan were freer than ever. Under prior Taliban control, women were barred from public life. In the last election, they made up 35% of the electorate. Girls have access to education. At the outset of the war, fewer than 1 million boys were in school and virtually no girls. Today, there are 9.7 million students enrolled in schools, and more than a third of those are girls. While I don't agree that those gains justify another 20 years of U.S. war in the country, quite the contrary. But I do believe that the U.S. could have withdrawn from Afghanistan in a way that didn't jeopardize the very life, well-being, and basic freedoms of millions of Afghan women. We could have done more if there was a will. now it falls. So, Kim, I would pose to you, because you're someone who's been outspoken about our endless wars and endless engagements, and I think we can all agree, listen, protecting women was not the reason we went in, nor is it a justification for prolonged military engagement. But could the Biden White House have done more to engage NGOs, the United Nations, and others to say, in our departure, can you step in and help these women who are going to be oppressed?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there was probably a possibility, had we been willing to negotiate with the Taliban and do a peaceful transfer of power, that we could have set up some protections and said, listen, we're willing to leave, we're willing to hand over the government to you, but these are the conditions that we want met in order for you to be recognized by the international community as a legitimate government. But we would have to stop short of anything that Saudi Arabia is doing. So we wouldn't be able to really cross over and say, well, we demand more rights for women than what Saudi Arabia gives. So otherwise, we've got a problem when it comes to our relationship with the Saudis. So I think it's really limited. And I understand that their culture is very different than ours. And it's sometimes for many of us, most of the time, it's very difficult for us to reconcile with. But I do believe that as their culture, as they become more economically advanced, as they have more opportunities, that they will progress, as we've seen more and more, as we've seen pretty much every society that sort of enters more into that technological age and first world does. But Ryan, what do you think? Do you think we could have done more for women?
Not without, continuing to occupy Kabul, I think, which could have been an approach that the international community decided to take. They say, look, we're going to have an endless occupation of Kabul. We're not going to wage war out into the countryside. But this is the city that is in the news that the international community pays attention to, and this is the one that we're going to pay attention to. What people have to remember is that 70 to 80% of Afghanistan is rural. And the conditions that you talked about prevailed under all 20 years of the of the American occupation of Afghanistan. Under the Taliban, women in rural areas generally were confined to their homes, had no reasonable access to education or to health care. Under the U.S. occupation, women were still confined to their homes and still had no access to education and health care in the rural areas of the country, which is almost all of the areas of the country. It's good that some girls were able to get to school. As they age out of some of those, that early childhood education, they're going to be put right back into that situation of not being able to leave the home, not being able to walk with someone who's not a relative.
Of 30 million people, and 9 million girls being in school is not a small number to recognize.
That's 9 million over like 20 years.
That's fair. So, to the broader point, the Taliban wants to be recognized as a legitimate government. The United Nations would likely be the most effective body to come out and recognize them. That's going to be an open question in the months ahead. The General Council meets later this year. Could this have been a carrot and stick to the Taliban to say, show that you will uphold women's rights and we will recognize you?
I mean, we had 20 years to compel our own clients to recognize women's rights in Afghanistan, and we didn't do it. Like, we did it in Kabul. Good for us for doing it in Kabul. Kabul's, up until a week and a half ago, was a cosmopolitan city. You walk the streets of Kabul, you see cafes, you see. It's safer than some American cities, or it was, a couple weeks ago. But outside of that, that was not at all the case, and we did nothing about that. The Soviets actually tried to do something about that, or the kind of Soviet-backed government. The Soviets urged them not to. They said, "Look, you're going to blow up your relationship with the countryside if the educated elite in Kabul try to instill their values on the countryside." That government tried to do it anyway. You actually said women's rights hadn't been in a particular place since the 70s. More like 1992, when the Soviet-backed government finally collapsed, and one of the reasons they collapsed was this clash with the countryside, where they were trying to push harder than they were able to on these particular values. Yeah.
The Taliban have done an interview with the BBC where they've said that they will be allowing women to continue their education. So they're saying that they're going to be adhering by actual Sharia law this time, actual laws of Islam. And prior, they were not so much. They were kind of living under a combination of Islamic law and kind of culture. And they're saying that that is going to be done away with. And under Islamic law, women are entitled to the same education as men. Now, are they entitled to the same jobs? No. But they are entitled to the same education. And there are even other laws that are actually quite surprising under Islamic law when it comes to women, marriage, and even, I know you've brought up rape, and that is very horrifying for us women. But actually under Islamic law, if a woman is not satisfied in her marriage, she has a legitimate cause to leave if she is not satisfied in the bedroom. That is actually a law. So that is something that they don't view like sexual relations between couples the same way that puritanical Christians do. It's actually much more progressive, believe it or not. So
under Sharia,
I think we have to kind of wait.
Yeah, but under Sharia law, women also can't divorce their husbands. So there's a lot to unpack here. I think it's very interesting insight and great historic perspective from Ryan. I would close with saying this: millions of women in Afghanistan are going to be subjugated to terrible things that are in some part a result of the way that we handled this withdrawal by the U.S. I would encourage anyone within the international community and U.S. government to think of how they can help in any way that's short of deploying more forces for a prolonged period of time. But with that, Kim, I'm looking forward to your radar next.